All right. Buenos dias. Good morning. Thank you, everybody, for being here. It is our pleasure to be hosting Dan Trecker as a research affiliate, a master's student at University of Victoria in the School for Environmental Studies. And I will let you tell us all about what you're doing. I can say I've gotten excited first reading your proposal and then talking in the lab some, thinking about shared interest in, how shall I say this? Polyhydric epiphytes. And it's been cool to see Dan's ingenuity in creating a Cloudforest environment with equipment in the lab. And I look forward to hearing more about the presentation. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks everybody for having me. So I've been down here in Monteverde for the past 2 months studying mosses and other moss-like plants here in the Cloudforest. And I just want to first say I'm super grateful for MBI, for the Institute for hosting me. I've had an amazing time and I wouldn't have been able to do any of this stuff without your help. So without further ado, I'll talk about these plants, which I like to call the magic carpets of the canopy. Partially because they're a little bit mysterious and they play a really important role in the ecology of this ecosystem. So the outline for the presentation today is going to look like, first of all, I'm talking about what bryophytes are and what makes them unique. Bryophytes being an inclusive term that refers to mosses and other moss-like plants. And then I'll talk a bit about the diversity of these plants globally and then here in Costa Rica, focusing then on some common bryophytes that you'll find in the area and highlight a citizen science opportunity on how you can get involved in documenting these plants. And then I'll talk about the role of these plants in the ecosystem and basically what I've been doing understanding the interface between their diversity and the water cycle. Okay, so what are bryophytes? Basically they are 3 groups of land plants, the mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. And these 3 groups are all united by kind of 3 characteristics. The first is that they're non-vascular, which means they have no ability to transport water and sugars through their bodies long distances, unlike trees and other land plants. They don't produce seeds, they produce spores, so they're much like ferns in that way. And then really importantly, they can't regulate their internal water content. And this is really important ecologically, and I'll talk about why in a later slide. Just in terms of evolution, these plants are really cool because they are the oldest, or the earliest diverging lineage of land plants. They're the first ones out of the sea to colonize land, and they've been really successful. They've been here for about 425 million years, possibly longer, just they don't preserve very well in the fossil record. And actually the relationship among these 3 groups, the hornworts, liverworts, and mosses, is still kind of disputed. So we don't know which ones came first. We just know they've been here forever. And for reference, flowering plants evolved around 120 million years ago. So they're very young in comparison to these bryophytes. So how do you actually tell these plants apart? Well, you kind of need a microscope most of the time, actually 2 microscopes. But for these main groups, you can kind of tell them apart just by looking at them. Mosses are usually leafy, and they have complex sporophytes or spore-producing structures. So in the top right, these are mosses. You can see the green is the leafy part, and the brown capsules, those are the spore-producing structures. Liverworts, on the other hand, are often thalloid. They look like that, or they can be leafy, but they always have simple spore structures that look like this, which is basically just a clear stalk with a bag of spores on them. And they all look like that. Hornworts, I think, are super cool, and they are usually thalloid, but they're always thalloid, and then they have these spore structures that look like a big horn. And these plants are weird and mysterious. I don't understand them really. There's not very many species, and they grow in weird places like in cow ditches and a pasture. And, yeah, they're kind of interesting. I mentioned that moss spore structures are complex, so there's a great diversity of what these things can look like. They come in different colors and shapes. oftentimes they actually have teeth at the opening of the capsule. And what these teeth do is that under dry conditions, they open up and allow, so the wind will blow the spore capsule around, and then the spore will fly out, hit a tooth, and get dispersed further. And then when it's wet, they close up, because these plants don't want to disperse their spores when it's wet, because they won't go very far. And so you get a great diversity of what those teeth can look like, the capsule shape and color. This one on the top is totally crazy. It's a moss that's adapted to growing on animal dung and is dispersed by flies, which is really weird. But they don't always reproduce sexually. They sometimes, actually a lot of the time, they reproduce asexually. And so these plants are interesting because they sometimes have features that are adapted to cloning themselves. So this liverwort here, you see all those kind of like cup structures? Those are actually full of like tiny little propagules that are waiting for a raindrop to land and splash the cup and splash them out. And these little propagules will clone the mother plant that way. So they're specialized in that way, but also what's really interesting is that any single cell of these plants will regenerate the mother plant. So you can, some of them, rather than actually go through all the effort of making these special structures, will just make their leaves really fragile, so that if anything touches them, they just shatter, and any of those little chunks will regrow a new plant. And so I've actually seen some artists in cities do kind of cool things exploiting this, where they actually take like moss that's growing on a rock, and they'll put it in a blender with some milk and like cornstarch and other weird ingredients, and create a milkshake. And then they'll go and like paint it on brick walls, and the moss will grow in the shapes of the painting. So that's like a really cool way to reproduce, right? And oftentimes when you see bryophytes out in the forest and they grow in these big clumps, a lot of those individuals are genetically identical because they've reproduced asexually. Okay, I said I'd come back to the water regulation thing. So these plants, they lack the ability to control the water content in their cells or keep it higher than that of the atmosphere. So essentially they're like sponges. When it's wet outside, they're wet and photosynthesizing and growing. But when it's dry outside, they shrivel up and they dry out. And so they'll wait there in this dormant state, not growing, until water comes and lands on them, and they'll rapidly absorb that water, open up, and start growing again. And so, because they can't control this water, they've adapted all of these traits that allow them to rapidly use and store that water externally on their leaf and kind of shoot surfaces. And this is really the reason why these plants are so small. They can't transport the water long distances, they can't hold on to it very well. So if they were big, they would just be constantly drying out. And so this moss is the same species here on the top and the bottom. It's just dry versus wet, which is pretty cool. And so some of these characteristics of these plants that, one of these characteristics that allows them to rapidly absorb water is this thing called papillae, which are just bumps on the leaf cells. And so this is a moss called Hedwigia. It grows on rocks. And on the right is a scanning electron micrograph of this plant. So these are the leaves up here. And the leaves are covered in these little bumps that look like almost like fingers on the cells. And what they do is they increase the surface area of the leaf so that when water lands on it, it can move it much faster along the leaf surface. And I have a couple of videos just to demonstrate the difference here. So this is a time-lapse video of a moss being rehydrated that doesn't have those bumps on the leaves. And it takes about 7 minutes, which is pretty fast still, for it to rehydrate from dry, right? On the right, this is a moss that has those bumps, and this is a real-time rehydration of this moss. So the whole thing takes about 15 seconds, and this moss goes from dry, dormant, to open and growing again. So this is, one of the reasons these plants are so special. Okay. Yeah, I was going to talk a bit about bryophyte diversity now, but keep that water stuff in your mind. In the world, these plants have the second highest number of species. They're the second most specious group of all land plants after flowering plants. There's about 10,000 mosses in the world, about 6,000 liverworts, and only about 200 hornworts, which, as I said, I don't really understand those plants and why there's so few of them. I just think it's cool. Costa Rica, for being a small country, actually has a super high diversity of these plants. There's about 636 mosses recorded, 582 liverworts, and 8 hornworts. And all the places in Costa Rica, Monteverde has been relatively well surveyed, at least well collected. There are about 400 bryophytes recorded from this mountain area, about 200 mosses, 200 liverworts, and 2 hornworts. But most of these studies have actually been focused on the Pacific slope, which is drier than the Caribbean slope, right? And so we need more collecting and studies on the Caribbean slope to get a better idea of actually how many species are right in this area. Another thing that's super interesting is that given the size of Costa Rica, it has the second highest endemism of bryophytes of any other neotropical country. So there are many species that are only found here in Costa Rica, and that's likely because the very variable topography with all the mountains, also the location between North and South America. It's been this site for a long time for plant diversification. And this map is interesting. So this is a map of global moss diversity. And if this was, say, orchid diversity or flowering plant diversity, all of those countries with high diversity would be right around the equator, right? But with mosses, they're kind of more spread out. Actually, in the north, you have a pretty high diversity of mosses. And because these plants, remember, they like to be wet, so they want to be in places that have a lot of water, and then also in places that are cooler. They really can't tolerate being hot. And so in the tropics, you have a huge diversity in places with mountain ranges, where they can be cooler and wetter. It's also why when you go down a slope, you don't see as many bryophytes as we have up here on the mountain. So they have an interesting distribution in that way. Okay, so now I was just going to showcase some of the interesting and common bryophytes and groups you'll find in the Monteverde area. My goal is to make a guide eventually that will be for common bryophytes in this area. I've got a bunch of really good photos, and I'll put that together in the next few months. So this is Hypopterygonium tamarasci. It grows on rotten logs and tree trunks. Super common, you'll see it on trails around here. Pilotricella flexilis is common in the understory on little branches. At my field site in the Caribbean slope, it's basically on everything. These are super cool. This is a family of liverworts in the Leguniaceae, which actually diversified here in this part of the world. And so there are many, many species of these plants. In the world, there is over 1,000 of those species, but they're really concentrated in the neotropics. Also, they grow on anything. I think that's cool. On the right, I included this not necessarily because it's really common, but mostly because I think it looks really cool. And walking around the Cloudforest, you can see this one. It's called woolly-wort. Looks like it's wearing a sweater. These two are both very common in the Cloudforest. This is Plagiophylla. There's probably about 50 species in Costa Rica. And it's by far the most abundant thing at my field site on the Caribbean slope. And then Herbertus, as well as another liverwort that forms really big colonies up in the upper canopy of the Cloudforest. Okay, these are the last two sort of common things I was going to show today. Bryopteris filicina and Creonodon densis. Both of these are extremely common here in the Cloudforest and a little bit further down slope. They grow on basically every tree in this area. Liverwort and moss. Okay, so I don't know how many people here use the app iNaturalist, but it's a good citizen science platform. Also, if you just want to get to know some species in a given area, it's a great way to interact with the community and get to know the species around you. And so I put together a project called Bryophytes of Monteverde, which automatically includes any photo observations of these plants that are taken in this area. And so right now, I just made it so there's 609 observations of bryophytes in this area. So far it's saying 78 species, but I haven't started identifying anything yet. But this is a good way, if you see something that you're not sure of, you can upload, and there's experts all over the world who are using it a lot. And yeah, so it's nice to have a sort of running species list, and I feel like it's a great way to get people out and engaged in this sort of thing. So upload photos to the website, and I'll see them and look at them. Okay. Now I will start to talk about the importance of bryophytes in Cloudforest, and I'm really going to focus on epiphytes and the water cycle. But these plants are incredibly important for the Cloudforest for multiple reasons. First, they contribute a lot to nutrient cycling, and actually a lot of these plants have a really tight relationship with nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and so they will actually make atmospheric nitrogen bioavailable into the system, so that's really important. Also, up in these tree canopies, they develop these massive soil banks that are basically just decaying and rotted bryophytes. And so this is a photo, you can see how thick these things can actually get. And those soils are important for carbon storage, also carbon cycling as they fall to the ground. And they're also habitat for many invertebrates, which are a resource for birds, amphibians, and reptiles that feed on them. Also, birds even use the bryophyte material as nesting material. So they're important habitat and resources for many species. But I'm going to pivot now to talking about their role in the water cycle and what I've been doing here. So anyone who spent any time in this area understands the importance of having this horizontal fog and cloud precipitation for the ecosystem. It's incredibly important, and it's a huge component of the total water that is in this system. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about how that works, but I do want to talk about the role that the plants play in the canopy in capturing, storing, and releasing that water. So these plants are super interesting in that they can do all of those things. And so the water that's coming in horizontally, it's being intercepted by these plants and released into the ecosystem. And this illustration on the right kind of shows some of the pathways by which water can make it to the ecosystem. So it can flow down the trunks of these trees and fill up the epiphytes, which will slowly drip it back into the ecosystem. It could be dripped actually just immediately off of the leaves to the forest floor, or it could be captured directly out of the air from these plants that are up in the canopy. And so of the biomass the living biomass of these plants that are up in the tree canopy, bryophytes can actually make up, in some cases, more than 70% of all of that biomass. So they're they have a large role to play in all of this. And this water that these plants capture can actually be greater than 75% of the total precipitation some forests get. Now in Costa Rica, I think it's probably a lot less because the proportion of rainfall is a lot higher than the proportion of cloud vapor. But in the dry season, when there's less rainfall and you still have some cloud bank, these plants are especially important. And remember, bryophytes are like sponges, right? So they're super absorbers. They're really good at capturing this water. It's not just that the water's landing on the leaves, they're actually pulling it out of the air. And there have been studies that have shown that this water that's captured by these plants in the dry season can actually maintain stream flow, which of course is an important ecosystem service. And I think canopies are particularly interesting, A, because I like climbing and being up there, but also just thinking about a tree as a place where a plant lives has always kind of boggled my mind. I can't really understand it. But it's interesting to think that as a habitat, they're super complex. So at the bottom of the tree to the top, you have increasing complexity as the branches are branching, getting smaller. You also have a pronounced environmental gradient where at the top of the tree it's warmer, windier, and brighter with lower humidity than at the bottom. And so I said that bryophytes are, they can't control their water. They're really sensitive when it comes to water and microclimate. And so you get different species occurring at different levels in the tree. And in fact, whole different communities of plants at different parts of the tree. And so my work is really trying to understand how these different communities and these different groups of plants are contributing to capturing and storing and slowly releasing that water differently. And so how do you actually do that though? And it's by looking at traits of the plants. So traits are any sort of measurable characteristic of an organism. And in most cases, so traits kind of do two things. They reflect species' responses to their environment. So a species can only live in a given place because it has the traits that allow it to tolerate that environment. But then also they can drive these ecosystem processes. And so an example of that is this moss, which somebody brought in today. So maybe we could pass this around. This moss is of the life form called a pendant moss, which means they have really long branches. And those long branches are specially adapted to intercepting fog as it comes horizontally through the forest. So that's a contribution to capturing that fog water, and it's this trait that's facilitating that in these plants. On the right, remember I showed you those liverworts that grow on leaves. So if you take one of those, peel it off, flip it upside down, put it under a microscope, this is what it looks like. And so the underside of the leaves have these pouches. And in these pouches, they store water. And so they store water for the reason that as these plants dry out, they want to keep photosynthesizing and they don't want to dry out too fast. And so they'll store the water. And so I'm curious in understanding how these different characteristics of kind of like local water storage in the plants and interception capabilities influence those greater ecosystem processes of storing water and capturing water and releasing it back into the ecosystem. So that's kind of like what my research questions are. Basically, I want to know what the trait diversity looks like in these different communities at different levels in the tree. And I want to know how important it is that you have a diversity of traits, because maybe all we need are actually just some species that have a few traits that are really good, really efficient at doing this. It's not really a diversity that you need. Okay, and so what have I actually been doing here? Like I said, my field site is on the Caribbean slope. It's at Finca Barclay, which is way up here. And this is the field site of Dr. Sybil Gotch in her lab at the University of Kentucky, who've been collaborating with me this whole time and have been super supportive, and I'm really grateful for their support. And yeah, so we've been out there climbing trees. This is the first thing we had to do, was climb some trees and collect some moss. So here we are sampling in this portion of the tree our bryophyte communities. And so we have 3 different zones that we're looking at: the lower trunk, kind of the inner crown, and the middle and outer crown. This part of the tree is very hard to get to without risking your life. So we kind of are here for most of the time. Yeah, so we pulled these bryophyte communities out of the tree, had a lot of support from super awesome climbers in Sybil's lab, and we measured some characteristics of the branches while we were up there, because those might also influence these plant communities. And then we took all of these samples back to the lab, and we had to remove the soils from them, remove roots and big chunks of wood, and get them just down to the pure moss material. And so they were ready for experiments at that point. And so I was looking at 3 kind of ecosystem properties: water storage capacity, so how much water can these plants actually hold; water retention, which is how long can they hold on to it for as they're drying out; and then fog interception, which is how much fog water can they pull out of the air. And so for water storage capacity, basically you take dry moss, you wet it, and then you weigh the difference. It's pretty easy. Water retention is you take those big wet moss clumps and then dry them out over time, which I underestimated how difficult that is here to dry and eat. So we ended up having to put them in the drying oven downstairs rather than leave them out on the counter, which is what I was going to do. So we dried them out over time to figure out what's the rate of water retention. And then finally, I had this crazy idea that I wanted to create a Cloudforest in a box. And somehow it actually worked, which was awesome. So we had this chamber which essentially pumped fog and cloud into this box, and it took the dry moss communities and exposed them to fog for an hour to see how much they could pull out of the air. And I just include this video because this is probably the most aesthetically pleasing experiment I've ever done. When you pull the mosses out, this big plume of cloud comes out, which is super fun. Yeah. And so that's basically what I've been doing down here in Monteverde for the past 2 months. That took a really long time to do all that. But the next step is to identify the plants and measure those characteristics that are important for water capture and storage. And I realized I started to like doing animations in PowerPoint presentations, which I never did before, but one of the cool things you can do is scan these plants on a flatbed scanner, and then use special software to figure out their surface area and different dimensions. And so that might be important for their ability to capture and store water. So I'll be measuring those traits in the next few months and doing a bunch of statistics to try to answer my questions and figure out which of these traits are really important for driving those ecosystem properties. And as I'm sure you know, the motivation behind all of this is climate change, of course. We have clouds disappearing and moving upslope here in Monteverde. That's been recorded for like 20 years that this is happening. And we're going to see changes in the epiphyte species composition, which means that the composition of their traits in those communities might also change, which means that they could function differently. And so it's super important that we know now how these communities are functioning, so we know what functions we might lose. And so this work is significant because it's going to help us understand the role that these plants, these little, somewhat insignificant plants, some people think, play in the Cloudforest water cycle. It's also going to add to the species list for Monteverde, which is important. And I say possibly Costa Rica because I wrote this slide a while ago. We actually have identified a few things that are new to Costa Rica already, and that's because we're surveying the Caribbean slope. And then it's going to provide this baseline to evaluate how these water-related ecosystem functions and services that are mediated by these plants change in the future. And that was everything I had planned to say today. So thanks. I'll take any questions. Yeah.
Super cool, thank you. So what happens with bryophytes, and maybe there isn't one simple answer to this. I'm more familiar with lichens, as you know. But when they dry out and then when they rehydrate, so lichens have this rehydration, respiration kind of burst, and there are a lot of interesting biochemical things that happen that require resources from the organism, and thinking about if they're getting dried out more often, if they're not being bathed in clouds as much, and what implications that could have. But I don't know how that process works with bryophytes.
Same, it sounds like a similar process. Like bryophytes can tolerate intermittently drying out, but they can't tolerate drought over long periods of time. And so I think those, if you're increasing those duration of those dry periods over time, we're just going to lose species that are more like hydrate adapted. And interestingly too, like I was just saying at our field site, it's a mix between pasture and forest. All of my stuff's been in the forest, but you can see that the communities on the pasture trees are very similar to the ones that are up in the canopy, like the outer canopy. And so the species that enjoy the shaded, more humid conditions, less windy down in the lower canopy, are probably the most at risk in terms of these forests drying out and getting more exposed. Yes, question?
From your map, it appears that your bryophytes are not really worried. I assume that freezing has no effect on them. Do you think they can regenerate? Does that kill part of them? They regenerate from spores?
Well, so that, like because they are able to sit sort of dormant for a while, the freezing doesn't necessarily kill them, although some species definitely have like antifreeze proteins and stuff in their cells to prevent dying, but the moss diversity of Antarctica is a lot lower than Costa Rica, I will say that. Yeah, I had something else to say about that. We'll come back to me. Oh, yeah, okay. So the supervisor I had in my undergrad who was teaching me about bryophytes, her work actually focused on glaciers in northern Canada and as they receded, and what she found was that there were bryophytes growing right where the glaciers had receded. And she did carbon dating of these bryophytes and found that some of them were 8,000 years old. And they weren't growing from a propagule or a spore. It was the same shoot of the plant just growing again. So it got covered in ice, sat there for 8,000 years, and then the ice melted and kept growing. And those species too, it's not like it's a different species, it's the same species you find, kilometers away. So, yeah, they can tolerate being frozen in some cases. If they're adapted to that climate, I would think that tropical epiphytes can't tolerate being frozen. Yeah. Yes?
It's not really a question, but maybe a suggestion. We, a few months ago, had a biomimicry workshop here, and it's something I've gotten super excited about since then. And really, I guess I gained greater appreciation for how science-based it is. And something that would really allow this field to advance more is if in publishing research papers, especially that have to do with functional traits, putting a little note, here's some possible biomimicry applications. Just thinking about water capture and what we could learn from these organisms growing on the tops of trees, and this here on the top of the mountain, and how we might take better advantage of water. It's not necessarily coming out of the ground. And just looking at some of the Hedwigia, I can't remember what the genus was, but just that structure of understanding surface area and how that might have applications in the world.
Yeah, that's true. I've never thought about bryophytes in terms of biomimicry, but yeah, I could see there being a lot of things. Because a lot of their structures are external on their leaf surfaces, right? So it feels like those things could be easily adapted. Cool. Sybil.
Thanks so much for your talk. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
It's so great to have somebody who's not working on bryophytes, and I hope that you come back. I had a question really more after our conversation last night that I was curious about, so I'm just going to throw it at you now. But so you were talking about in our sites in Barclay, that it's really all liverworts there. And I was thinking about sort of the ecological strategies of mosses versus liverworts, which I know nothing about. Could you tell us a little bit about why we have liverworts there, and what are the strategies of these two groups, or what you know about them so far?
So, as far as I know, liverworts, for some reason, they can't tolerate drying out like mosses can.
Mm-hmm.
So, some liverworts are adapted for that, but most of them prefer colder weather conditions. And that's why our site Barclay has all liverworts, because it's super wet on the Caribbean slope. But
the mosses could be there, but the liverworts can outcompete them in their ideal.
Yeah, and I can't use outcompete because apparently there's no evidence to support that bryophytes compete with each other, but they're more abundant. Yeah, and I don't know what physiologically dictates them being more successful in that environment, other than just liking more water. Yes.
You mentioned people experimenting with propagating the mosses, with making the milkshakes. I was just curious if you've tried that at all, or if you know a time period of how long it would take to grow those mosses, or just.
I've never tried the milkshake method, but I have tried propagating mosses, and it's so hard. I feel like that works if it grows on a rock or something. That might work if it's a rock moss. But yeah, the instant you move these plants a little bit, they just seem to die, which is weird. Although I do know people who grow peat bog mosses pretty successfully, but I don't know what their secrets are.
So it depends on the specific type of moss and what surface you're trying to grow.
Yeah, the best advice I have is that if you are trying to grow moss, you need to grow it on the original substrate.
Okay.
So if it grew on like silt, you need to grow it on silt, or if it grew on
Got it.
limestone, yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah, no problem.